And a lot of people who do understand a little bit more than just the surface, they understand that this war started in 2014 after the Maidan protests and of course the what I would call a genocide that's been happening in the Donbass. But you just brought it up, and we have to talk about it. It could be argued that this started immediately after World War II, maybe even before that war was over. We talk on this show quite a bit about Operation Unthinkable, which was that secret plan that Winston Churchill and his military advisors cooked up like 1 week after President Franklin Roosevelt died in April of 1945. Churchill gets this bright idea that he's going to repurpose captured Nazi soldiers, put them back on the battlefield with American and British and French troops, and invade the Soviet Union, our ally, which is the craziest thing ever, which is why they called it unthinkable. But in my mind, Dmitry, that was really the start of the Cold War. And it started even before the Second World War was over. Churchill was already trying to start a Third World War. And we had Nazi prisoners of war, Ukrainian prisoners coming to Western intelligence and saying, hey, we want to work with you because we have a common enemy. We want to go after the Soviets and we'll help you. So we ended up taking these guys in to our intelligence services, using them both in the Ukraine, and also we brought some to the United States. We brought some to Canada, brought a lot, including, guys like Stefan Bandera, the national hero there in Ukraine. He had a CIA code name. And it's my understanding that he was working on getting a visa to come to the United States in October of 1959. He was in Munich, hiding out, basically, because the Soviets were hunting him. But I think the day after his visa was approved, a KGB assassin took him out with cyanide. You want to talk about that a little?
With your permission, Laurie, I think I need to go a little bit deeper, even
Please.
before the Second World War, for you and our viewers to understand really what it is all about. What
Yes.
do we in Russia feel when we hear the rhetoric of Ukrainian nationalists right now, how this situation is being viewed in my country? So first of all, it will take some time, but I will try to be concise.
Please, take your time.
So,
Explain this to us.
Thank you. First of all, you need to understand that that Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, is not a city for Russians. This is the mother of all Russian cities. We still say so. So the whole Russian culture, Russian civilization has roots from Kiev, where the Knyaz Vladimir adopted Orthodox Christianity, and he was baptized in 988 in Kiev. So it's a special place, and the whole this part of Russian civilization, which was called Halitska-Volynskaya Rus, it was one of the bedrocks of Russian civilization from 1200 to 1392 approximately. And a lot of nationalities that lived there looked differently in comparison with how they look like now. For example, Lithuania was mostly Russian-speaking and Orthodox until the end of 16th century. But after the establishment of Rzeczpospolita, the Polish-Lithuanian state, there the Catholic religion started to oppress Orthodox believers and also to fight Russian-speaking population, the influence of Russia. So at the end of 16th century, only Catholic religion was allowed in Rzeczpospolita, though at the beginning there were a lot of Russian elements, and they had to convert to Catholicism, to Catholic Church to survive. And there was this Greek Catholic Uniate Church established in this country. But for you to understand, the Lvov or Lviv, as Ukrainians are saying right now, was a Russian Orthodox city for quite a long time. So I would say that also when we say Ukraine, the word Ukraine in Russia means it is pronounced Akraina, derives from this word. It means limit of land. And in Russian history, there were several Ukraines. It means that the land which was at the border of known civilization for the moment. So that's why the word Ukraine is very artificial, I would say. And the territories of current Ukraine were always referred to as Malorossia or Little Russia. So another historic moment, which is very important to understand what was happening, it was the partition of Poland. So the partition of Poland, the third partition, happened in 1795 between Russia, Germany, and Austria. And Poles were, of course, very angry, and they were promoting separatism. Each state treated Polish population differently. In Austria and Germany, the German culture was obligatory, and it was very hard to get education in Polish. Though in Russian part of Poland, the Polish education was promoted. Not only promoted, but there was big sympathy with Polish intelligentsia, with establishment. The Tsar Alexander I was very liberal, and he was admirer of Western civilization, and he favored Polish nobility over the Russian nobility. So a lot of them got really very prominent position in the society. It's enough to mention the foreign minister, Mr. Czartoryski, who also played an important role in the whole story. So he favored Poles, and he gave them control over a lot of things, for example, over education. And they were also asked to control education system in Malorossia. And I can quote advisor for Foreign Minister Czartoryski at this time, Mr. Valerian Kalinka. His famous saying was like, Malorossia is lost for Poland, but we have to make it lost for Russia too. That was the policy of the Polish establishment, and that reflected what they really wanted to do. And that's how this the problem of Ukrainian separatism started to be created. So the bedrock of Polish education was Kamieniecki Lyceum in Western Ukraine. And they started to promote theory that Russians are illiterate pagans, and those living in Malorussia, in territory of current Ukraine, are civilized people. That was the starting point. It also coincided with the first Polish uprising in 1831. So, but still there was big sympathy with Polish intelligentsia, with Polish establishment. And one needs to mention, for example, that very popular historian in Russia in the 19th century, Nikolai Kostomarov, one of major authors of historic literature in Russia, very much favored by the Tsars. He was also a student of Polish professors, and that's why he promoted also this Polish theory, and he claimed for the first time that Ukrainians are a separate nation, people living in Malorossia. They are different from Russians, though the language was the same. Language was a problem, but his disciple, Mr. Kuleish, Pantelimon Kuleish, he created alphabet for Malorussian dialect and called it a separate language. It was at the beginning of the 19th century. But the problem was that almost everybody spoke Russian in Malorossia, and even the classic Russian language owed a lot to the language reform which was created by people coming from Malorossia. So we can say that the current classic Russian language from that time came from these lands, from current Ukrainian territory. So can you imagine?
Interesting. Didn't know
yes.
that.
Yeah. So also the noteworthy development took place in Austrian part of divided Poland. The Polish nobility was oppressing Russians in Galicia, in the region of Ukraine, and Russians who stayed there, they were called Rusini. At some point of time, Austria used them against Poles because they were very loyal to Vienna, and they participated in the suppression of Polish uprising, for example, in 1809, and Hungarian uprising in 1848. And can you imagine that as a sign of gratitude, they were given from Austrians the regiment flag, which was in the colors of current official Ukrainian flag, blue and yellow. So it was presented to Rusyns in Galicia, in Austria. That's where it came from. But soon the Austrians, they became suspicious of the loyalty of Rusyns towards Russia, and they put them before a choice: loyalty to Russia or well, not being Russian speakers at all. So it was then the theory of Ukrainians being a separate nation became very handy, and they were promoting education in this language, which was very artificial at that time. So I can also cite one of scholars at this time, Osip Manchalovsky. He said, and it's very important, that being Ukrainian means to reject your past, reject everything Russian. That was the beginning of Ukrainian nationalism. So one needs to understand that until 1920, it's also very important, the word Ukrainian was used not to describe a nation, but to describe a political view. It's like, I don't know, libertarian, like democratic. So it was not a nation. It was people who really wanted to disassociate themselves from Russia, from Tsarism, claimed to be more liberal, more linking to the West. And a lot of those who actually promoted this Ukrainianism, they immigrated from Russia, they were expelled from Russia, and they found themselves in Austria, and they started to promote this idea of being Ukrainian as contrary to being Russian. And that's very important also to understand what's happening right now, because these are the roots of all these things. So during the First World War was, of course, a very important milestone, and the Austrians started to suppress the Russian presence in Galicia, and there were very cruel times. And I don't think that many people know, but the first concentration camp in history was against Russians. It was called Tallerhof, and it was situated in Austria. And any relation to Russia could lead to your arrest. Book, letter, newspaper, even Russian name. There were a lot of people executed because of Russian names, because they didn't want to change their names. And of course, Austrians were promoting those who were disassociating themselves from Russians and picking up this artificial at this moment Ukrainian language, which existed only in very, very few villages in Austro-Hungary. Well, I can give also some quotes of what Austro-Hungary wanted in 1914, for example, at the beginning of the First World War. The foreign minister Leopold Berchtold said that our main aim is long-term weakening of Russia. If we win, we will create independent Ukrainian state. So already at this time, independent Ukrainian state was viewed as as a tool to weaken Russia. And that's how it came to the moment that we are now. So I told you that the main ideology of being Ukrainian was created by Russians who were expelled from Tsarist Russia, who had opposing views. One of them was, for example, Mikhail Grushevsky. He immigrated in 1895, and he is the author of 10 volumes of History of Ukraine. This work was totally sponsored by Austro-Hungary, by Austrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And can you imagine, he was the first to simply to propose to call this Kievan Rus, the beginning of Russian civilization, as Ukraine, as simple as this. And can you imagine that in 1991, in the independent Ukrainian Ministry of Education declared his version of history, his 10 volumes, as the only correct interpretation of Ukrainian history. And even a law was adopted that forbids arguing with his findings. And this law exists right now. So it was not about history, it was about ideology. And there were also different immigrants coming to Austro-Hungary and forming this hotbed of Ukrainian civilization. Again, Ukrainian not as a nation, but as a theory, as a political theory, as anti-Russian civilization. Two of them are very notorious and worth mentioning. It's two immigrants, Nikolai Mikhnovsky and Dmitry Dontsov, Russians expelled from St. Petersburg, hating, of course, Tsarism for this. And they created the basic principles of Ukrainian nationalism. It's very important to understand, because when we say there is Nazism in Ukraine, we do not always mean that there is German Nazism in Ukraine. Nazism is mean supremacy of one nation over the other. So these two personalities, Mikhnovsky and Dontsov, they formulated the basic principles, 10 basic principles. The core principle was that Russians, Poles, Hungarians, Jews are enemies of Ukrainians. Ukrainians could not marry, for example, with them. They were not allowed to speak the language. They were supposed to speak only Ukrainian language. And do you know what was their slogan at this time? The slogan was Ukraine for Ukrainians, or Ukraine is the most important thing. So like Deutschland über alles, it was the same at this moment, long before the Nazi Germany. That's why these ideals, this understanding of Ukrainian nationalists was so perfectly matched with German fascists when they came to the Soviet Union, because they were absolutely thinking along the same lines. The difference was only what nation was at the core. And they, of course, the Ukrainians, respected Germans. They respected a lot of things that Germany was doing, and it was also because of the fact that Germany was also exploiting Ukrainian card, actively exploiting Ukrainian card against Russia. But I also need to say that a lot of blame, a lot of tragedy that is happening right now is the credit of Russian authorities at this time, before the First World War, the beginning of World War, because they were totally dismissing the danger of this trend, of this Ukrainian ideology that emerged. They were thinking that these are, children, and they were not realizing that they are playing with matches. So that's why they didn't do anything to suppress these dangerous trends. And when they understood, it was too late. And the First World War started, and this gin was already far away from the bottle. So coming back to Germans, on the eve of the First World War, one of very prominent German experts on Russia, Mr. Rohrbach, wrote that until Ukraine remains part of Russia, Germany's strategic goals will not be achieved. And this was also the core of German ideology vis-a-vis Russia, German approaches towards Russia. And of course, the revolutions in Russia, both February Revolution and Bolshevik Revolution, they gave enormous impetus to Ukrainian nationalism. As you know, that Russia, the Lenin government wanted to broker peace with Germany at any price, this famous Brest-Litovsk peace deal, and they didn't want to face Germans because Germans could easily win over and come to St. Petersburg. So they were ready to any concessions. And that's how Germans deliberately made Ukraine, which didn't exist at this time, virtually existed. There was some very short period when they declared something, but nobody recognized the existence of this country. So the Germans deliberately made Ukrainians sign the Brest peace along with Russia and along Soviet Russia. And Lenin had to obey because he didn't want problems with Germany. And that was, in fact, the first legitimization of separate Ukrainian nation. And Grushevsky, this famous historian, became the head of Ukrainian parliament. There was also a period of German occupation. I'm cutting the long story short. But as you know, in November 1918, both German and Austro-Hungarian empires ceased to exist, and there was another reality. So Lenin calculated this, in fact. But as far as Ukraine and Poland are concerned, Poland became independent. It was really a big present from Lenin to Poland. And in the middle of civil war and external intervention, the famous Ukrainian politician Petlura ceded Western Ukraine to Poland. That's how Western Ukraine turned out to be part of Polish lands. It's Kresy Wschodnie, as the Poles are saying. And I think that also many people do not realize, but the Bolsheviks contributed more than anybody else for the consolidation of Ukrainian national identity. And they laid a solid foundation for Ukrainian statehood. Because as I told you before this, being Ukrainian was being anti-Tsarist, anti-Russian, anti-monarchy, being more progressive. But Lenin, when he understood that this part of Ukraine was already in Poland, he wanted to create a counterweight. And he started, he created a Ukrainian republic in the east of current Ukraine, on the lands that were never Ukrainian. And there was only Russian-speaking population with some dialects, but these dialects can be found not only in Ukraine, current Ukraine, but in the south of Russia. And he started the real Ukrainization, forming this ethnic Ukrainian nation, Soviet Ukrainian ethnicity, because he thought that Soviet Ukrainians will not speak about separatism. So he started almost from scratch. Stalin also was very enthusiastic about this. And I can tell you that from 1921 until 1933, there was a campaign of active forced Ukrainization among ethnic Russians living in the east of Ukraine. And it was so efficient that by 1929, 80% of schools were teaching in Ukrainian. By 1931, 90% of media used Ukrainian language in the territory where ethnic Russians were living. And there were big protests, and they dropped this in 1932 or 33 because they were really starting to understand that this was too much. The boosting of Ukrainian nationalism was too much. But after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, after the Soviet troops entered Western Ukraine, the two Ukraines were united under the new Soviet identity, Soviet Ukrainian identity. And this Ukrainian identity already became national, ethnic, not political. Well, that's what I wanted to explain. And then comes this period of Ukrainian collaborationism. We need to say that this organization of Ukrainian nationalists, it was created in Vienna, I think in 1929, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
And it was created as a tool to resist the Poles, because Poles were actively Polonizing these territories. They were imposing their way of life. They were exploiting Ukrainians. By the way, they took revenge during this Volyn massacre, famous and unfortunate event when I think 300,000 Poles were killed by Ukrainian nationalists. It was because of this, because of the roots were there. So this organization was created in 1929, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the one which was headed by Bandera. It was not related to the Soviet Ukrainization of Ukraine. It was still in the West, and it was nourished with these principles of Ukrainian nationalism. As I told you, pure Ukrainian nationalism. Ukraine for Ukrainians. Russians are enemies of Ukraine. Jews are enemies of Ukraine, and that's why when it came to German intervention, the German occupation of Russia, of Soviet Union. Of course, they were natural allies with the Germans, because we're thinking along the same lines. They had the same enemies. Germans wanted to kill Jews. Poles also, the Poles, Russians, and Ukrainians also wanted to do it. That's why they were too ardent. And even Germans, at some moment, as we know from some memoirs, they were appalled by the brutality of these people. So they didn't have to teach them anything. It was basically their ideology. And these people, for them, of course, for Germany and for Ukraine, also these two forces, they were temporary allies, because, of course, Germans didn't care about Ukrainian nation, and Bandera understood it at some point. Ukrainians thought that Germany will just give them a nation, an independence, a national Ukrainian state with all these fascist principles. And they were respecting and fearful of Germans because Germans were too powerful. That's it. But of course, at some point of time, when Ukrainians nationalists understood that Germans were not delivering on their promises, they started to fight against Germans, and that was the moment when Bandera was arrested and he was put in prison, I think, in Munich.
But and correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sorry to interrupt, but as I understand it, that wasn't really much of an imprisonment. I understand that Bandera, Lebed, they were pretty much free to roam and could go about their politics.
Absolutely.
It's not like they were in a concentration camp.
That was far from imprisonment, but this is very important because the current adepts of Bandera, they try to put it on top of everything, saying that Bandera was anti-Hitler. He turned to be critical of Hitler only when he understood that Hitler cheated on him and that he will not give Ukrainian statehood, and it was only Reichskommissariat Ukraine for Germans. That's it.
Right.
So it was also very artificial, but current Ukrainians, of course, they feel a little bit awkward with such close interaction between fascists, German fascists and Ukrainian fascists. So they try to distance and saying that Bandera was seeking only Ukrainian independence. Same as Shukhevich. They, of course, try to sweep under the carpet all the facts that they were participating or giving orders for ethnic cleansing, for a lot of atrocities, for Holocaust. All these things are not in the focus of current Ukrainian elite. That's how Bandera was awarded the title of Hero of Ukraine, and he's national hero now, because he allegedly was seeking Ukrainian independence, even against the will of the Germans. This is ridiculous, of course. This is ridiculous. This is very politicized. And you also mentioned, Laurie, that a lot of collaborators were saved by the United States, by Western countries, mostly United States. There was a secret operation to keep all these people handy. And I know that there were the so-called Captive Nations Committee formed in several places, like in Washington. So it was not only about Ukrainians. It was about Baltic states, about Hungary. So, and these committees, they were infiltrated by former collaborators with Nazi Germany. And I think that the United States was deliberately closing the eyes on all these very shameful, I would say, situation, because they wanted to use these people as a fuel, as a tool against Soviet Union, and they made several attempts to do so. So, as you know, when Bandera was assassinated by KGB in Munich, Yaroslav Stetsko took over, and he lived in the United States. He had no problem, and his relatives immediately after the independence of Ukraine went to Ukraine from United States, and they played a very important role in forming the current ideology of Ukrainian nationalism. So they were all kept very handy, and gradually, step by step, they were brought into the independent Ukraine. It was not possible to do it like it happened in Baltic states. In Baltic states, the whole elite all of a sudden was overturned and overruled. It was also a very interesting development. These are small countries, and the elite that was there that sought independence, it was not as they were not looking at Russia as an enemy, rather as a neighbor. But all of a sudden, this elite was overruled by those immigrants who lived abroad and who had absolutely different feelings towards Russians, who also collaborated with Germans, and that's how we now have these very unfriendly nations on our borders, because of this elite nurtured in the West and brought artificially after the independence. In Ukraine, it didn't work because Ukrainian society, in fact, again, it was artificially Ukrainized, and a majority of people spoke Russian, and majority of people didn't associate themselves with Ukraine. For them, this choice of independence was really a chance, and they were not seeking this independence. It happened because of ambitions of Yeltsin. Mostly, he was the first to initiate the independence of Russia, which puzzled everybody. So Ukrainians there, they rejected this propaganda of animosity towards Russians from the outset. So the approach had to be very gradual. This brainwashing started in 1991. It almost succeeded in 2004 during the first Orange Revolution. But even then, even then, a lot of people rejected this ideology of nationalism, saying we don't want to be separated from Russia. In fact, we are Russians. We're just living in Ukraine. So they didn't succeed in 2004. In 2008, Yanukovych came to power. He was, I don't know why, considered to be pro-Russian president, which is totally not true.
Right.
And then in 2014, they succeeded. It also took a long history of brainwashing, a long history of creating artificially this Ukrainian nation, which was really a very ridiculous process, because on top of what I told you about historic facts, a lot of facts were really invented and brought into the history books. I, for example, some of Ukrainian patriots, real patriots, not nationalists, but patriots, they sent me quite a long time ago the school book. It's geography, 8th grade, for Ukrainian school children. It's a book that everybody was obliged to read and to learn. I can give you several quotes from this
Please.
book.
Yeah.
For you to understand. So, for example, of course, judging from this book, Ukrainian civilization is one of the most ancient civilization. In some other books, you would see that that ancient Ukrainians, they were fighting, for example, with Persians, with Greeks, with Romans. They were called Ukrs, and they came from the Ural Mountains a long time ago, several thousand years before. And of course, there are no traces of any Ukr civilization in any chronicles of Russia, of Poland, of whoever. But that doesn't matter. So. Just a quote.
Wow.
So in this book, it is said, it is not a joke, that given the fact that French are called the Gauls, that Galicia is in Spain, that Portugal is Portugal, it means that there is a big chance that this country have Ukrainians and as their predecessors, because of Galicia region in Ukraine, which, as I told you, was actually Russian, and there were Russians living there until the First World War. And also, don't laugh. It is very possible that the Jews also could come from Ukrainian territories because of Galileo. That's the logic that is really being introduced into the school books. So these people are thinking this. What would these school children realize? They would see we are the most ancient civilizations. Forget about these Russians. By the way, in Russia, in Ukrainian ideology, Russians are not Slavic nations. We are Finno-Ugric. So only Ukrainians are Slavic, Poles are Slavic, but Belarusians and Russians are Finno-Ugric. We are not Slavic. I don't know why. It was the theory
That
also.
makes no sense.
It makes no sense whatsoever. It only shows that we are pagans, we are not civilized, we are not Europe, we are Asia, and Ukraine is Europe. And that was something that was invented long before these 2014 things. So everything that Ukrainian nationalism is having on board right now dates back to these times that I described to you. And that's why for us, when people tell us, I'm far from saying that Ukrainians do not deserve statehood. I'm far from saying that I do not recognize Ukrainian nationality. But you need to understand how it was created. So when people are telling us you need to recognize that Ukraine is a country on your borders, yes, it is. But there are very many nuances that I told you. So how this country was formed, and how in fact this Ukrainian history emerged, that this was a geopolitical project. It was geopolitical project then, and it is geopolitical project right now. It was the tool for weakening Russia then, and it is still the tool for weakening Russia right now. So when you analyze this thing, you need to look through our optics and through the way we understand this whole crisis. There is this dimension to it which many Westerners really do not understand, and we feel it. It is very sore point, I would say, in everything that is being said about Russia-Ukrainian relations. I just wanted your listeners to realize how deep is this crisis and how deep is this geopolitical struggle against Russia, where Ukraine was and is a tool.
Well, I'm a student of history, and I know you check out a lot of my work on Twitter about this, and I've taken a deep dive certainly in the past few years, to try and understand as an American what the story really is over there. And I've, on my own, come to the same conclusions. Much of what you just said agrees with where my research took me. So it's good to hear you validate that. And also to hear you say that this really fired up after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. That posed I guess, an existential threat to those who opposed communism. And so much of the Holocaust, or even before the Holocaust, you take it back to the pogroms of, the Russian Civil War, that period of 1917, 18, 19. So much of that, people in the West misunderstand. They get fascism confused, and a lot of that's the way we were taught incorrectly, is that it was all about the hatred of Jewish people of the Jewish faith. But that's actually not what was going on over there. The first genocides were those pogroms after the First World War, during the Russian Civil War, and their targets were Russians, specifically communists, who happened to be Jewish. And later, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when what I call the Ukrainian nationalists, I call them the OG Nazis. I call them the original gangsters, because they were already practicing eugenics. They were already practicing their master race and all that kind of stuff years before anybody ever heard of Hitler, before there was a Nazi party.
Exactly.
So as I
They
understand
they had their own way to Nazism, and that's why it is so easy for them now to practice the same ideology. And when people are asking us questions, how do you find German Nazis in Ukraine? Well, there are, of course, those who worship German collaborators, but Nazism and fascism is also Ukrainian. It's not particularly in Ukraine, but it is product of that time, and Ukrainians were one of the most ardent promoters of this racial theory. But for them, Ukraine was, of course, in the center, not Germany. Like you know that fascism is Italian word, so it started in Italy. So it was superiority of one race, superiority of one nation, condescending treatment of everybody else. Ukrainian nationalists, they lingered plans before the Second World War of having under their control the whole of Eastern Europe, not only Malorussia, but the whole of Eastern Europe. There are historic books on them. So they are no different in this way from German fascists at this moment. And this is also not totally linked only to German fascism. This is Ukrainian fascism, Ukrainian nationalism.
Right. And it's like you said, there just happened to be at that point in time a meeting of the minds. The Germans, the Ukrainians, they were already practicing much of the same philosophy and genocide, and they were, a match made in hell.
А кто Берлин-то?